Hello and welcome to day 6 of the summer series. We are live every day for 3 weeks this summer. I'm Amy, your host for today, and although you're not used to seeing me on the screen, I'm always here in the background, and I've had the pleasure of watching every single talk so far behind the scenes, and what a great start we've had. But we're almost halfway through, which is kind of crazy. Tomorrow actually marks the halfway point, so make sure that you share the event with anyone that you think might enjoy it so that they can catch the rest. Don't worry if you can't make every session live. All of the talks are made available on demand shortly after we finish. For today's session, I have the pleasure of introducing 3 people that I've seen speak many times. So I know you're in for a treat, and they're my new best friends. We were talking backstage. So I listened to their podcast. It's absolutely great. Highly recommend that you listen to the Calm Edge Rebels podcast on wherever you get your podcasts. But I was telling them that it does make you feel like you are their best friends, even when you don't really know them in person. But Jenny Field, Trudy Lewis, and Advita Patel are 3 business owners and consultants with a focus on comms in business. Together, they're known as the Calm Edge Rebels. Today's session is a bit of a different one in the format of a mini podcast episode, and we'll be bringing together themes from their latest podcast season and their one-day coaching retreats in London. Over the past few weeks, they've been talking about the feeling of overwhelm, how we keep going, and the need to stop and refocus to push forwards with our goals. So welcome, Jenny, Trudy, and Advita.
Hello.
Hello.
So I will let my best friends go, and I will see you.
Thank you, Amy. I am Jenny Field, and I'm one part of the Calm Edge Rebels. Before we kick off, I'm just going to clarify that this is a mini podcast episode, but we're not recording it as a podcast episode. We're just doing it in the format of our podcast, which is a conversation around a topic, and then we're going to move into tips in the last sort of 20 minutes. And this time we want the tips to be answers to your questions. So if you've got questions and can ask them in the comments, we'd love to get to those to be able to answer them. So before we kick off, I'm going to let Trudy and Advita just say hi, and then I am the host of our podcast today. So I've got all the questions about refocus and overwhelm, as I'm in a mini crisis, but it'll be fine. We're going to solve it today. So Trudy, do you want to say hello?
Yeah, hi everybody. As you know, I'm Trudy. I'm the other part of Calm Edge Rebels. I'm the edged bit of Calm Edge Rebels. And I'm really excited to be here.
And I'm Advita Patel, and I'm the Rebels, as you can't tell by my little neon sign behind me. And I own an internal communication and employee experience consultancy in Manchester, so just outside of London for a change.
Outside of London. I'm just flown in from Madrid, so you're doing very well.
You make it sound so bougie.
I mean, I'm not far wrong, let's be honest.
It's quite timely for this topic, though, so that'll be quite good.
It is. It is. So we said we were going to talk about a time to refocus today, and and this came on the back of a conversation Trudy and I were having the other day, where we were catching up on all sorts of things and struggling to manage that feeling of I've got so much to do and I can't sort of get my hands around it. But also there's lots of conversations I've been having at events I've been attending or things I've been speaking at, where lots of internal communicators are talking about planning tools, planning content, how you manage the volume of information that's kind of coming in. So I wanted to kick off the conversation today and ask you both how you're feeling, really, to start us off, because you might be sitting there going, I feel absolutely fine, or we might not be. I know I've shared with you already this week my new list format that I'm working on to try and help me out. But Trudy, I'll come to you first. How's that overwhelm, focusing feeling for you?
Gosh, at the point of at which I am now, looking through some of the things to do with the business, I am pretty overwhelmed. um, in a good way though, because it's a lot of things coming at me all at once, coming all sorts of directions, and looking at a large amount of things all at one time, and it feels like that the deadline is the same for everything. So yes, I'm in the midst of it, but I feel as if to say I'm managing it a little bit. So that's nice. And it is about being calm, or calming yourself down and being present, and really thinking about how you would start to plan and navigate your way out of it. So yeah,
I've got this image in my head of you like crawling out of like a mountain of like post-it notes or something. I feel like Advita will be living the dream after she's got back from Madrid.
Exactly.
Or have you come back to a like?
No, you know what? I think this is really important, and we talk about this quite frequently on our podcast, and even when we do our retreats, about taking that time out. And I think the three of us have very, vibrant lives, and we've got lots going on at any one time. But we're also very good, I think, when we remind each other to take that time out. Yeah. And Milan, I have been to Milan, but it's Madrid this time. Look at me. I promise I'm not going away every weekend. Madrid was intentionally booked in because I had a very busy June with the conference and the book launch. So having that time away for 4 days has allowed me just to reset and reflect on the next 6 months of business and work. And I feel I've had some very similar conversations with the people that I work with and coach as well, about feeling very overwhelmed and also tired and exhausted and just a bit fed up.
Yeah.
And I feel that when you're in this hamster wheel of life at times, you do need to take a pause and do something that's outside of your normal routine, just to kind of give you that reset. And that's what Madrid did for me. And it was glorious, having those time, that I had the privilege to have those few days away. But it was only 3 days, and those 3 days made a massive difference. And I think we need to do more of that. Maybe not Madrid if we don't want to go Madrid, but definitely time out.
Go to Milan.
Oh, Milan. Any of the European destinations.
Only that begin with M, though. That's
Manchester.
Mozambique, Morocco. Oh, I'm on a roll.
Any more M's out there?
Any more M's? Let us know with the M's of where you want to go. But it's interesting because I was talking to someone today, and I know I shared this with you both this week. I feel like I'm back in 2020 a little bit. I feel like I've got that sort of COVID feeling of, I can't go from one thing to the next thing to the next thing to the next thing, which I used to do really well. Whereas I feel like I'm back in the right. I just need to focus for half a day on something rather than run around. And I was talking to someone this morning who was saying, we were saying we wanted to get our steps up and get outside, and they were saying I can't do it. I'm back to back 9 till 7 every day, and because I work in an organization that's got multiple time zones, I can't get out of that. I have to sort of keep going. Now, part of me with my boundaries hat on from our coaching retreat days is going, just put the time in and go for a walk. You can do that. But I think having the confidence or the courage to make that change and do that is often what stops us. So what are the things, and I know this is a bit tippy, but what are the things that you've done where you've been able to do that? Because I do think people struggle with that in terms of how do you get out of that hamster wheel of life to be able to put that time in, because it's easier said than done, right? It's much easier to talk doing things than actually doing them, and it's easier to just keep doing the same thing over and over again, but that's not going to get you a different outcome. So as much as I can just say, well, just stop, nothing bad will happen, I've done it, it's fine. How do you do that? Like, what's that first step to be able to, right, I need to have a break and I need to have the confidence, the courage, whatever it is to do that? What's that first step?
I think you have to go slowly. You have to go slow, right? And I think if you have got into the habit of doing a 9 to 7 without any breaks or time, it's going to be very difficult for you to all of a sudden to put in those half an hour breaks to allow you to go for those walks. And it can be quite overwhelming just doing that because all you're thinking about is the amount of work you have to get back to for you taking that 60 minutes out of the day. So my big piece of advice to anybody who feels that they're stuck is do it slowly and carve out 5 minutes. So if you've got no time in your diary from 9 to 7, then where can you slot in those 5 minutes just to take that step away from your computer or wherever you are and just go outside or step away in a different room, whatever that 5 minutes looks like. And then I would suggest you add a minute on every day. So you do 5 minutes on Monday, 6 minutes, 7 minutes, and do it that way, very slow. And it's quite intentional, and it becomes a bit of for me, it became a bit of a game. Because it's a bit like, I need to do it. It's really important to do it. And then I started to talk about it more with other people in the organisation when I worked in house, to say, I'm taking 8.5 minutes today to go outside. I know, look at me. But it really started to make a bit of an impact. And before I knew it, I had, I couldn't quite get to the full hour, but I had 25 minutes in the day where I could get outside. And it wasn't going out for lunch or anything like that. It was just going outside and just walking around the block and then coming back inside again. And I think that's what you have to do. I do think it's a big, big deal if you all of a sudden start blocking out these hour blocks and you're like, oh my goodness, I can't do it. And then you just won't do it. You'll just move on. So
no. And that's my problem, is people that are like, what doesn't get scheduled doesn't get done, whatever that phrase is. And I'm well, I'll just move it.
Yes.
I literally just
it's in your control. No, but it's in your control to do that, isn't it? I think a lot of the times we think that we can't change things in our lives, or we look at our days and we say, oh my goodness, I've got so many things. But this is where we have to have that balance between the amount of things people are telling us to do and the amount of things that we actually do, because we need to get things done. We need to get things finished. And there's a huge part about resetting how we're doing things and so on. And also looking at the consequences if we don't stop. So what kind of people will we be if we allow the overwhelm to get to the point where we are beginning to show signs of being stressed, show signs of being anxious? What happens to us next? And I think it leads towards burnout. And I think that's why, to Advita's point, I love that type of, taking bite sizes into the breaks that you need to have, because the breaks are important, but also trying to build the habits that help you with that. So it could be anything from, I'm going to go to the gym every morning, or I'm going to go for a walk every morning, and having those small chunks of regular things that you say you're doing. That means that when it does get overwhelming, when it does get busy, you've got like a bank of things that you're already trying to do. That thing. And the other thing is really identifying what works for you, because a walk might work for me, but you might need to just sit quietly in a room, or you might need to go and cook. Cooking is a really good way for me to clear my head, and that works for a lot of people as well. So it's finding out the thing that really works for you, so when you do take those 8.5 minutes, they're really meaningful.
I just wanted to add one more thing before we move on to the next one.
Sorry.
Is remember that you're treating what the hours that person that you're referring to, Jenny, 9 to 7, it's become the norm, not the exception. And I think when you start making it into a habit, it becomes a normal behavior. So your leaders and your people in your organization just believe that you doing 9 to 7 with no breaks, whatever, it's just a normal behavior for you, because you technically allowed them to believe that's normal behavior for you without the exception. And I get the whole global challenge, when you've got global teams across the world and you've got different time zones, but only you can protect your time, and only you can put those boundaries in place, because people will just keep taking away from you without you actually saying stop.
100%. And I always talk about when I was global head of comms, so similar problem, right? Global teams. And I would get the 6:16 train into London. I'd be at my desk at 7:30, and I'd usually leave about 6:30. And I probably wouldn't break lunch. And I loved it. I didn't feel in any way like I was doing too much or anything. I was quite fine with that. But I did have a moment where I remember going and speaking to my boss and saying, look, the business is doing very well. I don't have anywhere to go if it doesn't do well. So I'm going to still come in on the 6:15 because I'm really happy doing that. I'm an early person, but I'm going to leave at 4 so I can get home and get to the gym. And then if anything happens, or if anything does go wrong, or we need to find extra time, I've got that time to go into. Whereas at the moment, I'm stretched so far that I if anything does happen, I don't have anywhere to go other than when I sleep. So I need to do something to put it back so that there is that buffer. And I think that's, for me, is often what I try and remember now is actually, you know, we're sort of plodding along. We've got client work to deliver. We've got research projects to do. I mean, plodding along for me is not really plodding along. There's like 2 research projects on the go, 5 client projects. But, you know, it's not that horrible manic feeling or that feeling where you might have so much to do. One of the things I wanted to ask, though, was whether or not you can ever not feel that kind of overwhelmed feeling. And I know we live in a society today where we love a label and we love a bucket to put people in, and we love a diagnosis for stuff. But is feeling overwhelmed just part of modern society, in terms of there is a lot going on because we live in a world that's quite fast paced, there's a lot of technology, and we're choosing to be in that space. I've got friends that aren't on social media or any of those things, but is that just part and parcel of life in 2023? And we're all, you know, managing that and juggling that in lots of different ways. I mean, I guess I'm kind of thinking, is there really a solution, or are we constantly looking for, you know, a whole grown up, like next week I'll be fine. Next week I'll be fine. That's just ridiculous, and that's never going to happen.
I think it's on your environment. In your, like, I go back to the, you know, you have to make that choice on how much you want to get involved in. I think we did a podcast episode, didn't we, about the centre of concern. And you have to make that decision whether that's your centre of concern or not. And it can be tough at times because you want to get involved in everything and you want to understand everything and you want to be part of everything, because otherwise there's guilt plays a big part in your life. You know, your friends are talking about something that you don't really understand. You feel like you should because everyone else is talking about it. So you think you need to up your knowledge in that space. But sometimes this is why reflection and reset is a really important part of your lifestyle, because you do need to take that step back and go, do you know what? As much as I do find that particular topic really interesting, it's not really in my central concern right now. And what I do want to focus is on X, Y, Z. And you have to take that control again. Because other people, you know, other people's belief and opinions about certain things can easily transfer onto you. And it depends on the kind of community that you're part of. So I do think there is a lifestyle where overwhelm isn't an everyday thing. But I think it's more tempting to be involved in a lot more things now because we have access to so much more.
Because we've all got FOMO.
we all get FOMO. We also not only in FOMO, but there's this whole kind of ridiculousness of comparison that X number of people know so much about this. I really should know more about this because everyone's kind of talking about it, and you feel like everyone's talking about it because the algorithms around you is telling you that everyone is talking about it. So you feel like you're not as clever enough as other people, or smart enough, or you need to be more knowledgeable in this space. And sometimes you just have to say, do you know what? No, that's not where my genius lies, and I'm okay with that. And that does take a level of confidence and courage to do that, because I think we live in a society where we feel we need to know everything about everything.
Yeah. Trudy?
I think society, you know, Advita is 100% right. Society is set up for us to be overwhelmed. So the idea of being overwhelmed is pretty much all around us, no matter which direction. Whether you're working in a high-powered job or not, you know, the propensity to become overwhelmed is so strong. But a lot of it is around our response. You know, how are we going to respond to it, and how are we going to act on the things that come our way, and setting those boundaries. So yes, we can say it is kind of unwieldy and out of our control, but we have the control. And to Advita's point, she talked about the circle of concern and influence, and that's exactly what we have to look at. We have to look at, well, what am I going to place my attention to? What am I going to put all of my energy in? Or you always say, Jenny, which hill am I going to die on? You know, what fight am I going to have? You know, what are the things that I'm going to really invest in, rather than looking after myself? So the balance and the things that we're talking about to bring that balance is all around your own responsibility. So you can allow yourself to get immersed in the whole societal kind of overwhelm, or you know, it's fashionable to be overwhelmed and to say, oh my gosh, I've got so much on my mind, you know, that kind of thing. So you can stay in that space, or you can choose to say, well, do you know what, I'm going to look after myself and have a bit of balance, and I don't have to be everywhere all the time. I don't have to be involved in everything that's going on. I can step back, and what that makes you do is it makes you focus on the things that you value and the things that are important. I think that's a stronger place to be than actually just saying, right, I'm everything to everybody.
And as you were talking, and you sort of have nicely segued into my brain there, it's like, you know, we're one mind, which we say a lot, right? Is the values piece. And we talk a lot about our values and what they stand for. We've done episodes on it on the podcast. It's a big part of how we kick off our coaching retreat day in London, where we ask people to look at their values, because it's often it is the foundation of a lot of decisions and everything we make. But I wonder if there is something around how widely that's done in terms of people's values. I know when we've done 5 retreat days, I think now our next one is in early November. And I think most people that come haven't done a values exercise when they come on that. And we've talked as well around the importance of values, and something I was reading actually in a book that's probably behind me somewhere, but I think it was Lewis Howes' book about greatness. And there's a lovely statement in there around the fact that your values and my values are different, and therefore my decisions will be different, and that's okay. And I think to your point, Advita, of that comparison piece as well, is we forget that our decisions should be different because our values are different. But I wonder if there is something around the feeling of overwhelm being mapped to knowing your values and being true to your values, and whether there's a stronger correlation there than maybe I've thought about before in terms of those two things coming together.
I'll give the example. All of that's absolutely good, because I'll give the example of somebody I coached recently, and she was very senior, an associate director. And when I spoke to her about values, she hadn't done her values. She hadn't thought about them, and she really didn't know what her values were. So we worked through that, and she came up with some values that meant something to her. The next time I met with her, she said, oh my goodness, it's almost like she had a revelation, a eureka moment, because suddenly she said, I've applied my values to how I'm doing my work and to how I'm making some decisions about my work and my personal life. And it has just revolutionized how I do things. So she began to, everything she was doing, she began to look at them from the lens of my values. And it was only because she understood that. And she said, all this time, I'd never really thought about my values and where they fit into the whole scheme of things. So I'd say it's one of those really critical things that a lot of the times we miss and we don't think about. And if we've done the exercise of knowing what our values are, we have to then do the next bit, which is, well, let's see, well, how does that play out in our everyday lives?
And I think there is this link to, I'm feeling overwhelmed, maybe because I'm not living true to my values. I'm not doing the things that I really want to be doing, or I'm trying to do too much, or I'm trying to give my values equal weighting. I think, Advita, you've spoken on previous podcasts and with us about values that are your kind of current values or values, and they've got a name which I can't remember, and I'm not sure that you will be able to, because I remember us talking about it on the podcast of the different types. Can you remember that conversation?
Yeah, the satiable and insatiable values. So there's some values that stay on there's some values that are core foundational values that will always be on your value list, and there's some values that will come off your value list. And I think the reason we talk a lot about values is because you need something to anchor your belief system to. And if you don't have anything to anchor your belief system to, you do have a sense of overwhelm. And when you have a sense of overwhelm, it can knock your confidence. And when your confidence is knocked, it can impact your self-esteem. And then you can see where this is kind of going, right? So then when your self-esteem is knocked, you don't have pride in yourself at times, and your self-worth is knocked. So then you overcompensate by taking on too much work or doing too much to try and show your value. But when you've got your values and you know what your values are and you anchor them to your beliefs and your purpose, you can stay quite steady. And I always say to my coaches that you become like Teflon a little bit. And it doesn't really matter what everybody else is doing around you, as long as you are aligning with your values and your purpose. Which is why, anyone who's listening or is re-listening to this, do your values. There's so many tools out there that you can do and use to kind of identify what those values are. And they don't need to be words. They can be statements and they can be phrases, whatever they are. But you need to understand you before anybody else can help you. And we say that all the time in our coaching retreat, that if you don't know who you are and you don't understand what your values are or what your belief system is, then it's going to be very difficult for you to identify your barriers and blockers.
Yeah, and I think there is something in that around maybe kind of retrospectively doing your values. I know when we were in New York, when we were speaking at the IABC World Conference last year, and I had this sort of violent reaction to something, which we sort of don't really talk about anymore. But it's a really good example.
It's over, it's gone.
But I think it's a really good example of acknowledging your values kind of the opposite way round. So Advita and I ended up sitting down and talking about it in depth, because I was like, what is going on for me here about why I feel so upset and angry and all of these quite strong emotions about something. And that's when you were saying, oh, let's work through your values because there's something in there. And then we found it, while we were sort of working through it. But I think sometimes it can almost add to the overwhelm of, oh, now I've got to do my values. But if you think about something where you have had a really strong reaction to, then there is a value underneath that that's driving that reaction. And that's often a way to go and have a walk and think about, why am I reacting so strongly to that? So reliability is a big one for me. But congruency is a big one. So things that I say and things that I do have to be sort of matched. And I'm trying really hard to work on myself to get better alignment there, and making sure that if I'm saying stuff, then I'm actually following through with actions. And it turns out I feel quite angry about people who don't do that, which we've talked about recently. But I would encourage people to look at it from that way as well. So if you're struggling, if you're sitting there looking at a blank sheet of paper or whatever, and we'll share some links across our socials to the blog posts that we've done on values that link to the value sheet and things like that. We'll pop that across on socials after this. But sometimes that can feel more overwhelming. So just try and think about a time where you've had that moment of, oh, this is really making me angry, and then it will help you sort of work underneath that. Because I know we all have had conversations with people on our coaching retreat days around, okay, well, let's get underneath why that moment was such a trigger, and then let's unpick that and see what we can do to make some changes.
And just quickly to the point that you just made, Jenny, about people feeling as if to say it's just another job, so it's really it's hard work to get this done now because I've got to get this done as well as everything else. But the truth is that there's so much importance, so much value in doing the exercises that you suggest, for instance, in a coaching session. I can't say how valuable it is to take the time out, even if it's a short space of time, just to have a look at it, read it, go and find the values tool that works for you, and then do that exercise. And then afterwards you're like, actually, it's really had a benefit to my life. So sometimes we do say these things about, somebody says, oh, you should read this book or you should do this activity, and then we say, oh, one more thing to get done. It's just adding to my overwhelm, but actually ultimately does not do that. It does the opposite.
Yeah. And it doesn't take very long, does it? I think sometimes things, and we've talked about this between the three of us, how we're sort of all slightly different in terms of how long we think things are going to take. Like, I think things are going to take a really long time. Advita thinks things are going to take no time at all. And Trudy, I think you're pretty much right in terms of how long things take you, whereas Advita and I...
Yes and no. I mean, I would lean towards, I think that they're going to take forever.
Yeah.
So, yes, I lean towards
like, that'll take me, Advita's like, it'll take me like 10 minutes, and then it takes you like 2 hours.
That's all aspects of my life, right? Even if I've got to go somewhere. Well, if it's a 2-minute drive, it's a 2-hour drive.
What's your new phrase as well? Last minute, best minute, I think.
Last minute, best minute. Yeah, I didn't think that was a new phrase. I thought everybody used it, but obviously
it's
not.
It's a good phrase, though.
Last minute, best minute. Yeah.
Well, I say it to myself a lot now when I'm doing something at the last minute. I'm like, last minute, best minute. Oh, I love it. So we've done about half an hour, and traditionally on the podcast, this is where we move into tips. So if there are any questions coming in, Amy, feel free to come back in and ask us anything, or we can move straight into some tips about how people might want to do things a little bit differently, or how people might want to refocus. So, here we go. Hello.
Back in because I'm going to act as a fan, and I actually have a question that's popped up from listening to you talking. It seems like there is a massive overlap between feeling anxious, feeling stressed, and feeling overwhelmed. And I think sometimes you can mislabel which root feeling it is that you are actually feeling. And often you'll be feeling a mixture of all three. So my question to you is, does that matter? Does it matter if you mislabel the feeling, if you think you're feeling anxious and actually the root of that feeling is overwhelm because you take the same steps to move forward anyway? Or is it important to differentiate because you might tackle them slightly differently?
So I would say I think the feeling of overwhelm, feeling anxious or feeling a bit stressed is very individual. And I think I might say I feel overwhelmed, but that exact same feeling in you might be that you feel a bit anxious. So I think it's such an individual thing about how it feels and maybe what language you're comfortable with. I always say I don't often feel anxious. It's not something I feel I can kind of label for myself, but I can feel overwhelmed. And I know when I feel stressed, and they are different feelings for me in terms of, I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed versus I'm feeling stressed. And I know if I'm feeling a bit stressed because I'm full of rage and I know that about myself and I know what to do to mitigate that. So for me, they're how I interpret those emotions. And I think that how we do that is quite individual. I think what's important in terms of the resilience work that we do is to acknowledge the emotion and then put in things to help you move past it. It's an emotion. It comes and goes. So it's making sure that you're not over labeling in terms of a medical diagnosis, unless you have a medical diagnosis, and that is different. So anxiety is different to feeling anxious.
Yeah.
So that would be my sort of 2 pennies.
I was going to add that overwhelm. So I think it's almost, you can look at it as a sequence, and for everybody, it's going to be different. So overwhelm in a sense could be the starting point, and there are certain things that you're noticing about yourself in that space of being overwhelmed, and then it would move on to stress, and then it could move on to anxiety, and then it could move on to burnout. But those are different things that happen to you along the way. So if you recognize certain things, certain feelings that are coming up for you when you're in that space of being overwhelmed, then chances are it's very likely that you won't move on to being stressed, or you won't move on to being anxious, which then have a different set of feelings. But whichever feeling you're having, it's really important to sit in that feeling for a little while and question yourself as to what that feeling is and why are you feeling that, or what's happened to get you into that state. So it's taking that step back and looking at, well, I'm feeling this way. Why am I feeling this way? And to Jenny's points, when she was explaining that thing about her values, that's exactly what she did. I'm feeling angry. I'm feeling a certain way. Why am I feeling this? And she had Advita to come along and say, maybe you should look at this. And that's key, actually. That's a really amazing way to look at it.
I don't think labels, I don't think it matters unless you have got a medical diagnosis, to be honest, because I think we spend so much of our time flapping about with that label. I'm like this, I'm like that, I'm like that. And my advice is get to the root cause. Like, what is the root cause of that? And it could be a person, it could be an item, it could be a theme, it could be a topic, it could be an environment. There's different triggers that will cause that feeling in you. And to Jenny's point, you need to identify what that feeling is. And it doesn't matter what you call it, to be honest with you. If you're feeling that you can't progress and it's stopping you living the life that you want to lead, and it's stopping you doing the things you want to do, then get to that root cause. And I think some people look for like quite a big thing. This is why I feel that way. And often in my experience, it's something small that's triggered, and it's like the death of 1,000 cuts. And there'll be one thing that just tipples you over, and that's where that burnout comes in. So my advice is, don't worry too much about, is it overwhelm, is it stress, is it anxiety? Worry about where is it coming from and who is it coming from, and what do I need to do? What do I need to do to stem that, and focus on the solution on that first.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, because if I think about when we have, the coaching retreat, Advita and Trudy do coaching individually through their businesses as well. There's never a point where people come to us on the coaching retreat day and say, look, I'm feeling really overwhelmed. And we go, okay, here's the toolbox of how to fix that. It's like, okay, what's going on? What's happening? Like, let's talk about, what's in there. And that's why when we do our retreat days, we have an application form and we talk to people beforehand so we can understand a bit more, and then we tailor the sessions to make sure they're right for those. And that's important. And any good coach should be doing that. There shouldn't be someone that's able to just talk about one specific thing, because as with Vita's point, labels aren't overly helpful. And the words I use to describe something will be different to yours. And in different countries and continents, they'll be different for different people and different cultures and stuff as well. So that would be.
So linked to everything you've just said, I mean, you've mentioned noticing overwhelm in each other and being able to kind of support each other through that. How do you do that? How do you support people around you if you start noticing these signs of overwhelm? How do you facilitate that with each other? Do you just ask a direct question? Or is it always just,
we've all got very different approaches on how we do it. All three of us are very different.
Yeah, we tend to overshare. I would call it we overshare, probably because we know each other very well.
We do. And our boundaries as a friendship group, as we've learned, are not a good benchmark for others. But I would say, to Advita's point, I do think the three of us are quite different. Like Trudy, and I don't think you'll mind me sharing, Trudy, like you'll sort of go very quiet, and that's when we kind of know to reach out to you and say, are you all right? And sort of check in on you. I think I tend to just come to you towards the end, or I'm like, oh my god. And I don't know about ads.
I leave
constant stream of consciousness.
Lets it all out. Just lets it all out.
I just voice note. Like, I am like the podcast queen on our voice note, which is a nightmare for some friends. But with these two, I just don't care. They're going to get 15 minutes. This is what I mean. But our boundaries are very different from other friendship boundaries. We each have a very different way of managing our own overwhelm. And for me, I like to talk it out to others. So I don't really hold it in. But there are different communities and friends that I would share depending on their. This is one thing I will say to people, that you have to be quite self-aware enough to know what's going on in your friendship circles. And sometimes you may have some friends who just keep dumping stuff on you, which is causing you to feel more anxious or more overwhelmed or stressed on their behalf sometimes. So you have to be self-aware to know, can your friendship circle manage that and understand? If you're like me, who's an oversharer and will voice note for 15 minutes, there'll be certain people in my community that I will not do that to, because I know it will impact them more. So I will choose. You have to make sure that you're choosing how you share and who you share that to quite carefully, and that's quite important, because you do have to be self-aware, because you can damage relationships, I think, as well.
And I think the other part of it is also not being afraid to reach out to people. So if I'm in a bind, I would probably not be afraid to reach out to any one of these two. And I think it's the same for anybody. You've got to Advita's point, it's knowing the right thing to say to the right people, but also having that courage to reach out to somebody if you are feeling a bit overwhelmed, because somebody, that sharing it, that conversation might be the one thing that brings a bit of calm to your life and puts a perspective on it that's a bit more realistic.
Which is why we're all advocates of coaching and mentoring, right? That's what we truly all three of us believe in. And it's not because it's what we do, but it's also we've seen the impact it has. Yeah. So if you are feeling that you can't lean on to certain people, or you're not, you don't want to, because that's also a choice, then look at getting a mentor, or look at investing in a coach. There are so many things out there to help you. Go into a community as well. You don't need to have an individual mentor or coach. Find the community that you can lean into, and find your place.
And I think there's a couple of things that have sprung to mind for me as we've just been chatting, because I think there's something for us around, we know each other very well, so we know when there's something wrong and when to sort of reach out and say, look, are you okay? There's also something about when people do reach out to you, if they do, is I have to ask them if they want me to offer advice and help, or if they want me to listen, because I'm a natural fixer. So I immediately go into, right, this is what we need to do. And I've had several conversations with friends and family, friends who might be going through some marital challenges, family who are just juggling, childcare, single parent, whatever it might be. And it's kind of asking that question. Do you just want to come and go for a walk and talk? Or do you want me to offer some advice, and kind of checking in? And that's really important, especially if you are a coach or a mentor, to make sure. But there is something about walking and talking which if you do suspect that somebody in your circle might be struggling, or if you feel like you're struggling, then go for a walk with someone, because you're not looking at them. And that's why it's often a really nice way of being able to say, look, I'm just feeling, you know, and I use describing things. So I'll say things like, oh, I just feel like I'm in a tornado and I can see it, everything spinning, but I can't get hold of anything. And that's often how I'll start to feel if I'm really struggling, because having a visual is quite helpful for me. And then you can sort of feel validated, you can talk it through, but walking and talking is a really nice way of doing it if you're able to do that, because then it doesn't feel quite so like, right, can we just come and have a coffee? And then you've got to really look at someone, which can sort of feel a bit uncomfortable if you're being a bit vulnerable as well.
That's a really great tip. And we're running out of time, but this conversation is so interesting that there's one more question that I have, I think, which is when people are struggling to figure out what the root cause of the feeling is. So you're feeling overwhelmed, but it feels like it's 100 things that are on your mind and also nothing, you know, and you know, when you kind of pick those tasks apart, that actually they feel very small, but that feeling is still there. How would you help someone to kind of understand what it is that's the root issue, and then help them kind of make steps forward?
I think you have to list everything down. You know, one of the things I will always say to people, just write it down. And I you know, really interestingly, if you asked me this question about 5 years ago, Amy, I would never have said write it all down. I would have just been like, oh, I'll be fine. It's just like scribble. I was never a list person or writing things down, but I say, if there's little bits of everything, it's what I just said before about the death of 1,000 cuts, right? Like 1 or 2 things is fine, but you keep cutting yourself over and over again, you're going to bleed to death. So write every single thing down that's got going on in life, and split it into tables or into columns, whatever works for you, or just a big long list, which can take the time to do this, by the way, because it can be that in itself can be quite overwhelming to do that. So if you are at the brink of that overwhelm, then just focus on personal, or focus on professional, or focus on work, or whatever it is that you feel it's coming from. And then do the priority thing. So Jenny always talks about eat the frog. So what is that one thing that is really dragging you down? Just do that first thing, get it over the line, and it's less painless than you actually think it is. You know, you make it into a massive narrative in your head that it's a big deal. And that, to your point, it's often when you just do it, it's not. And we always say, don't we, eat the frog, the one big thing and 3 little things. Because you can't do everything. It's got to be one big task and then 3 little things every day, and go through that list until you get to the end of that kind of big sinking ship that you feel like you're on.
Yeah, and that's what I do. So this week, I said to Advita and Trudy yesterday, you know, God, I'm really struggling with focusing and paying attention and getting stuff done. And I can easily spend like 2 hours in my inbox and achieve things, but I don't feel like I've achieved things. So I'm spending kind of 10 minutes at the start of my day with a cup of tea and just working out what are the 5 things I need to do that day. And I'll list like meetings or phone calls in there as well. But there might be 3 to 5 things that are not meetings and phone calls that I need to do. And that helps me sort of, you know, make that list. I think the other thing, Advita's right, it's got to be a list, whether you mind map it, whether you put it on Post-it notes, whatever it is, but you could do it with someone else. So I will quite often, you know, sometimes I do it on my own, but I have an operations manager as part of my business, Redefining Communications, and we will sit every month and go through everything in quite a lot of detail to make sure that we've got that list. And doing that together, I find hugely helpful, because she's looking at things from a different angle than I am. And it means we can just make sure we're capturing things. So if there's someone that you can sit and do it with, whether that's a partner, a friend, a colleague, you know, or a coach or mentor, then that is just really helpful, because it makes it actually a little bit lighter if you can do it with coffee and cake. Firm believer in lists with coffee and cake.
3 seconds. And I think there is a lot to be said about having that conversation with somebody. So for me, because it's all about perspective, sometimes the best way for me to get clarity on what exactly is the problem is to bring that problem to somebody else and to have that conversation. I will be thinking of the catastrophe, you know, it is over. It's going to be too big, and so on and so on. So because I overthink things, and because of that, it's really important to have somebody else that you can bounce things off and say, this is how I'm thinking of it, this is how I'm looking at this problem, and the person can have that conversation with you that sometimes just makes you realize that the elephant is really just a mouse or something like that, or you know, another analogy like that.
Or an ant.
The eagle is a
lion,
finch.
and you know, I don't know. Whatever it is, I would have looked at it as, you know, there's a hurricane coming. It's all encompassing. And then they will say, but no, it's just a little rain cloud in up there. So
yeah.
I think that perspective piece is really, really important. And the best way to do it, in addition to writing it down, because sometimes writing it out really helps as well, but having somebody else to bounce it off is critical for me. That's a really good way of me doing it.
I'm loving our weather analogies, by the way.
I know.
Tornadoes, hurricanes. We've also
clouds.
got lions and eagles and mice. We've covered a lot today in our
I know.
analysis.
Well, it's been wonderful. And I think something that's a great way to close is on those tips. If you're feeling overwhelmed, pick 1 big, 3 little, or 3 to 5 things, write them down and get someone else involved. Talk the problem through with someone else. So thank you so much, guys. I've enjoyed every second. We could go on forever, but we have to close at some point, and unfortunately that point is now. So thank you so much, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks,
Okay,
Amy.
thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
So I know we could have gone on forever, and there is a lot more where that came from. And don't forget to check out the podcast, the CalMed Rebels, for more. I know that you'll all be hungry for more, the same as I am. Make sure to join us tomorrow, same time, same place, where we'll be joined by Ali Bunnin, who'll be talking to us about mixternal communications. But for now, it's bye from me.